Welcome to Beltech. So just before we start off with the podcast, can you start off by introducing yourself and what it is that you do for our audience?
Yeah, so my name is Elizé, and I am a UX design consultant, educator, and content creator. So right now I'm working predominantly on social impact projects, and I also teach Adobe XD for Adobe. I teach enterprise clients. I also teach students, those who are trying to learn UX at General Assembly and Springboard, and I create content on Instagram as well as on YouTube.
Right. Interesting. So how is that going? Is this something that you've been doing since how many years now?
I've been doing UX in particular for 5 years, and I've started to do education and content creation a year ago.
Right. Interesting. So the topic for today is what is inclusive design and how companies can think of it in terms of its UI UX team. So first things first, what is inclusive design to you?
Yeah, I think designing in a way that just allows more people access to your products. So just allowing wide ranges of diverse people access to products. And this could be for people who have impairments or that don't have impairments. It's just allowing more people to utilize your products.
Okay. And I see that a lot of companies are actually adopting this whole new design experience into their products and services. So why is it particularly important if you're operating in the IT industry, for instance? And according to you, what are some of the essentials for an inclusive design toolkit?
I think, I guess I don't really think about it being particularly important in the IT industry. I think it's important regardless. I think about restaurants, right? And how back in the day, not every restaurant had a ramp or a door handle that's accessible to all people. And maybe if you go into a restaurant and it's only white people that work there, yeah, for some people, they wouldn't even notice that. It doesn't bother them. They can walk right up, go inside, feel very comfortable. But not everyone is going to feel that way, right? Some people may not be able to actually get inside the building, or maybe once people get into the building, they don't feel very comfortable because they're not seeing, they don't feel very welcome because maybe the other people there are all white people and they're a brown person and it makes them feel uncomfortable. So I think about it in that way. And I think of websites and products as, you have those are your products instead of a restaurant. So you have to think about it in the same way is, am I allowing more people into my business? Am I allowing more people into my product, or am I excluding certain groups? And that means you're losing out on money. Right. And then also it means for certain types of individuals, they might be feeling a lot of angst towards your company. And that's why there's a lot of, lawsuits that are coming out right now, and have been coming out, I guess, for the last probably 10, 12 years around accessibility for products and websites. And so I think for as far as toolkits go, I think the web content accessibility guidelines that have been around, I guess, since about 1999, and have been getting more and more, have gotten more intricate over the years in what are those guidelines. And I think it's important for everybody to study those guidelines, designers as well as developers, because both have a large part in abiding by the guidelines. I think also I use tools in my design tool in Adobe XD. I use a plugin called Stark. It allows me to see what people can see if they have visual impairments. I can also test out my color contrasts through that same tool. There's also some Google plugins that you can find around accessibility that can help out a designer as well.
Right. So you mentioned about the designers and the developers working towards it, and we'll get to that in a few minutes' time. So is it something that, do you think it's something that's particularly limited to the design team, or is it more like a company-wide thing? Like, for instance, the senior management, when we talk about the senior management, how big of a role can they play in really implementing an inclusive and accessible design for all in their products?
I think that everybody in the company needs to be aware of the implications if you do not become accessible. So understanding that you can get sued, how much are you willing to potentially lose out on as far as, monetary value with your clientele if you exclude certain audiences and so forth, and that needs to just have there just needs to be that awareness, because it is more expensive to start thinking about inclusive, and thinking about testing with different audiences, thinking about accessibility with different disabilities and so forth. It does mean a little bit more time and a little bit more cost. So everyone has to be on board in order to get your team onboarded and understand those guidelines and how to abide by them.
Right. And can you elaborate on the role of the unicorn, like the developer and the designer, that's particularly important for companies these days in helping to bridge this gap?
Yeah, I mean, it's funny. I never really like the idea of, or I don't believe in the idea of someone being a unicorn developer and a designer, like being great at both, unless you've had 10, 15 years of experience. And there's just not that much of that, where you would have at least 7 to 10 years of design experience, 7 to 10 years of development experience, and gone really deep into both. I have yet to meet anyone that has that, maybe because that is a unicorn, right? I've never met them, but they're probably out there. But I do think more people call themselves that than they really are. So I do think that what's important, though, is that everybody needs to understand that it's still about the user and the user's needs, their pain points. What are we trying to solve? And to use technology in order to meet those needs. Now, it's always frustrating when it tries to go the reverse. Hey, we've got AI. Now what can we do with it? How can we use AI in our current product? Well, sure, that can make sense, but it's much better to go the opposite way around. What is the actual need, and what technology is out there that can serve this need accurately and in the best of ways, not to try to kind of fit it the other way around. And so I think it's really good for designers as well as developers to have an understanding of the technology that's out there in order to support users best.
Right. And I think a big part of making sure your software design is inclusive is to work closely with the developers. So what are some of the challenges that such teams typically face in terms of design, and how can your engineering team specifically, since we work in the IT sector, be taught to make UI UX more inclusive? Like you said, that you either have a good handful of years of design experience, or you're a developer, you really specialize in it. But let's say you need to come up with a really inclusive and accessible design. What are some of the challenges that you feel that these teams can face, given that there is no such thing as a unicorn per se?
Well, I think that everyone needs to be aware of the guidelines. Mm-hmm. So the web content accessibility guidelines, that's a really great place to start. There's also material design and Apple accessibility guidelines. So you can really dive deep into that. And there are courses that you can take online. Some are free, some are paid. And I do think that that's, again, like another investment I think that the company needs to make, is to get all of the whole team educated and on board and understand accessibility. And so I think that, that's one aspect of it. And then of course there are more things that we can do as designers, in particular around being inclusive and incorporating inclusive practices throughout the research and design and testing process. So bringing in when we're researching and talking to individuals, who are we talking to exactly? And are we just thinking about one type of person that we're trying to design for? Meaning, we're only looking for people who can hear well and can see well, and we don't even think about it. We're just like, we're looking for this, type of shopper. Well, we're not even thinking about the variances of that type of shopper. So bringing more inclusive practices throughout the process is also going to be really important, and also to share that information once you've gotten feedback from your testing and your research with different types of user groups, to share that feedback with the development team, with the product team, and with various team members in the company, for them to really truly understand how we're starting to think about being inclusive, and so that they can start building that empathy as well, and not just for the designer to feel that empathy through that research.
Right. Speaking of empathy, is it correct to say that I read something that inclusive design is also termed as empathetic design? Is that correct?
I think everyone has a different definition of what it means. I do think that being one of the main soft skills of being a designer, a UX designer in particular, is being empathetic. And it's so very different than being a graphic designer in that way, because we're thinking of how can we serve this person? How can we meet their need? And not just very high level with, okay, we have this product that meets their need, but how can we think about how they access the website to buy the product? How can we think about what's it like after they purchase the product, their customer service experience, all of that? How are we constantly serving this person and making the best experience for them? And a lot of times it means we have to really understand who they are, where they're coming from, what problems they're having, etc. And it is empathetic experience.
Right. And you touched a little bit about the importance of having diverse users when it comes to really testing your product. So how big of a role does the usability testing stage really make in, making sure that your product at the end of the day is all inclusive?
I think that, like, ideally, of course, and the pie in the sky is that we have a testing experience for all different types of user groups with all different types of impairments, and have that product ready to go. But oftentimes that's not how it goes. And I think we're maturing as well as an industry to get there. And also, again, it depends on funds as well. I think that the thing that I actually just learned myself, because I have not done that much testing with people with impairments until very recently. I was designing a survey questionnaire experience, and we were testing it out with seniors, people 55 and over, which is a user group I've not tested with before. We were testing with people with different types of disabilities. One person had a very short attention span, so couldn't remember the question halfway through. It was going halfway through the question was being asked of them. So there's all these different things that we had to be aware of. And the other thing was that there was a third grade reading level. But what I love about this experience was that, yes, we have to consider writing for people with short attention spans, who are seniors, who have and who have third grade reading level, but that does not exclude it from other people. It actually makes it much more easier for other people who have sixth grade or or above reading levels. They're like, oh, I really understand these questions. It's super easy to move through them. They're short. And so it actually makes it a much better experience for all people, even though through the testing, we were testing it out with a very specific user group with all these impairments and challenges. And I think it was very eye-opening for me to have that experience and to think, okay, how can I bring more of this into my design research process? How do I bring this to my clients that I work with as well and show them the importance of this? And I think that it's, very humbling and still challenging to think about it in this way, because even if you think about, major groups that you want to think about with hearing disabilities and visual impairment and physical disabilities and so forth, you're still missing out on a lot of groups. You can't think of every single type of person. And it's the challenge of how can we get there? And just makes me think about how design is still fairly immature. And it's, I'm considered a senior UX designer after 5 years. That's not a lot of time. And so what's the design community going to be like? How are we going to think about inclusivity in 10, 15 years? It's really quite exciting and very humbling.
And do you think that gets a bit tricky, because at the end of the day, you are designing for people, like you're trying to make it all inclusive, but at the end of the day, you can't possibly design for everyone. So how can you kind of achieve that perfect balance between the two?
Yeah, it's an interesting challenge because we're like, don't ever design. If you design for everyone, you design for no one, right? Is the motto that you try to be like, do not think of every single person as your user. But I always think about my target persona as someone who has a certain need that we're filling with our product. So if the need is, let's say Uber, I need a ride from my house to school 3 times a week, and I want it really quickly. Well, that's my persona, is somebody who needs that ride. That's the main persona. That's their need.
Right.
Then you can go into more niches, into many different persona types. Maybe there's a student, maybe it's a working professional, and go in that way. But then within a student, within a working professional, there are many types of groups that you can be thinking about. There are people who have hearing, visual impairment, etc., who are students, who are working professionals. So it's not like you are saying that just because your persona is not going to get so in depth to where you're saying that this person does not have any impairments, that they are only white people, right? It's not going to get that specific. It's more on a situational and scenario and user needs and pain points basis is what the persona is based off of. And then you could have variances to that. There can still be somebody who's visually impaired that meets that persona that you can test with as well. So I think that it's that there's a challenge there, of course, but I think that it's fairly easy to move around that idea of designing for everyone. Does not mean that you can't be inclusive for everybody.
And I take it that user research is very, very key to this.
Yeah, I think that, again, like we talked about empathy, you cannot feel empathetic when you look at a graph with numbers of who your users are, right? When we look at analytics and we see the types of users that are going onto our site, etc., they can start to just feel just like that, a user, somebody who's using us or using our site, and they don't feel like a person with needs and problems and pain points, and we really don't know much about them besides what those statistics. So going and doing the research helps us gain that empathy, and also to understand the why behind the what. So yes, maybe people are using our product in a certain way, but why? And that's what we find out through the research and through the testing. And again, it makes us much more empathetic as a company, if we go through that way. And then to me, that means that you are going to be more of a long-lasting company, and that's how I see it. I think the companies that are design forward companies are the ones that are going to prevail. And we see that with companies like Airbnb and Spotify and of course Google, all these companies who have huge design teams that are thinking about human-centered design. They are very successful, and I think they will continue to be, because they're constantly having their ear to the ground, testing out, seeing how they can be more inclusive to more groups, and seeing how they can constantly shift their product based on those needs and pain points.
Yeah. So you touched upon our last point of the day, which is that you talked about how being a design forward company is really the way to go. So do you think an inclusive design strategy should be implemented across the company's business model?
Yeah, definitely. I do. I think that it's hard to say that for everybody right away. I work with a lot of startups. So yes, of course, the startups I want to work with want to be accessible, but it's hard to think about so many different types of groups and all the different things that their needs are
So,
right from the bat.
so how do you guide the startups that you work with around this?
So I typically will say, okay, let's start with one type of user group and still think about accessibility, but not going in too deep into every type of group. I say we still follow the accessibility guidelines, and we'll think about hearing, physical, and visual impairment. It depends on the type of company I'm working for too, because I worked for, a startup recently that was a physical product that was a car experience. And so we're thinking, well, we want to make sure that if someone can't hear a certain sound that's coming from the car, can they feel it in the vibration of their phone while it's in their pocket? What are the other things that we can think about? So we are thinking about accessibility, but we can't think about it for every single group initially. Just go with the types of groups that you think, the ones that we can address at least initially in the first phase, and at least be aware of who you're not addressing in the beginning. Like, who can we not address right now, but that will be in the roadmap.
Yeah, I think that's a smart way to go. So that kind of wraps up our session for today. Thank you once again, Elizé, for joining us.
Yeah, thank you so much. I appreciate it.